Nothing can separate the story of two men whose deaths are 10 years apart, but entangled in the 890 feet of water at Boesman's Cave in South Africa. Dave Shaw and Dion Dreyer never met, but you can't tell one man's story without the other. Dave Shaw was an Australian airline pilot flying for Cathay Pacific. He was also an avid cave diver. Because Dave was flying internationally, he was able to dive regularly at dive sites all over the world. One of these dive sites was a site called Komati Springs, which was an old asbestos mine, which was turned into a deep cave diving site and run by Don Shirley. Dave and Don became friends and often dived together. The pair shared the same love and devotion to deep cave diving. Dave Shaw also liked the idea of setting new records using his modified closed-circuit rebreather. In 2004, Dave and Don decided they would set a new depth record for a closed-circuit rebreather by diving to 271 meters or 890 feet in Boesman's Gat. Boesman's Gat translates to Bushman's Hole. In December 1994, long before Dave Shaw and Don Shirley dived Boesman's Gat, Nuno Gomes had attempted to reach the bottom of the 890-foot, 271-meter deep cave using an open-circuit system. In 1996, Nuno Gomes set the world depth record in the cave, bottoming out at 927 feet or 282 meters deep. Up to this point, rebreathers had not been used to dive so deep. To be fair, there weren't many instances of any equipment or people diving so deep. Don Shirley remarked that more men had been in the International Space Station. Nuno Gomes had used an open-circuit system to complete his dive. An open-circuit system is a scuba unit that holds air or gas for the diver to breathe in, and when the diver exhales, the gas is released into the environment and escapes. An open circuit. If you look at most standard scuba diving units, you are looking at an open circuit system. A rebreather, on the other hand, is a closed circuit system, where the gas that is breathed out is recirculated back into the system. The carbon dioxide is scrubbed or removed using a filter that absorbs CO2. Of course, the diver has then exhaled and used up the oxygen in the breath he exhales, and so the system has a gas cylinder of oxygen which is then added back into the mix to balance out the oxygen levels as the diver takes his next breath. The net effect is that a diver on a closed-circuit rebreather will effectively use fewer gas bottles, and he will also not emit any bubbles. Closed-circuit rebreathers are popular with underwater filmmakers because they don't have to contend with bubbles getting in the way of their shot. What this meant for these deep cave divers is that they didn't need to carry as many backup or stage gas cylinders into the cave. When Nuno Gomes completed his record-breaking dive, he used 54,000 liters of air. If an average 10-liter dive cylinder holds 2,000 liters of air, that's 27 cylinders just for Nuno Gomes, and not including his support divers. By contrast, when Dave Shaw dived to the bottom of Boesman's Gat in 2005, he used 5,800 liters of gas. That's about 3 cylinders. Now this is important because gas equals time. When you dive to those depths, you need to do decompression stops on the way up. The longer you spend at depth, the longer you need to take coming up to the surface. Just the sheer logistics of setting 27 cylinders at various stages or depths is a feat unto itself. Plus, there would be a number of additional cylinders just in case. For Dave Shaw, he could practically carry 3 cylinders himself underwater. Not to say that he did, he still had stage cylinders set at various depths. But what it meant is that he could afford to spend a little longer at the bottom than Nuno Gomes did, and still not need as much equipment as Nuno. And, true to his nature of pushing the envelope of time and depth, Dave Shaw reached the bottom of the cave. Knowing he had a little bit of time on his hands, he decided to take a look around. In fact, he didn't take long before he spotted something in the cave that he immediately recognized, and I have no doubt sent a shiver down his spine. In December 1994, when Nuno Gomes first attempted his record-breaking dive, tragedy struck during a practice dive. Dion Dreyer was a 20-year-old diver with some 200 dives under his belt. He had been excited to be invited to help on this record-breaking attempt as a support diver. A support diver would be positioned at a certain depth to help facilitate logistics like setting stage cylinders, relay messages from divers, and assist in an emergency. It's thought that he must have blacked out because of a buildup of carbon dioxide. This could happen when a diver overexerts himself, perhaps working too hard carrying cylinders into the cave. Towards the end of the dive leader did a head count and noticed one diver was missing. He went slightly deeper to check and noticed a light fading into the depths. He chased the light down for a moment, only to realize that the light was fading faster than he was gaining. It has to be a chilling moment of realization when you make a decision that to chase a diver into the depths of a cave is probably going to kill both of you. And so you have to leave that diver to his fate. On the way back to the surface, he caught up with the team and gestured a blood-curdling hand signal. Dion Dreyer's parents put a plaque at the entrance to the cave to commemorate their son's life. For divers who entered the water at Boesman's hut, this sign served as a chilling reminder that deep cave diving was dangerous, and that at any moment during their dive they could come face to face with the decomposing corpse of Dion Dreyer, whose body was never recovered. So when Dave Shaw took a moment to scan the depths of the cave at 890 feet, he immediately knew who he had found. Dave tried briefly to pull Dion out of the mud he was stuck in. After a moment, he realized that, for one, Dion's cylinder would need to be worked out of the mud, and two, his dive plan did not include recovering a body. He didn't have the time, the equipment, or the preparation to bring this body back to the surface without jeopardizing his own life. Dave tied his cave reel to Dion's equipment and made his way back to the entrance of the chamber. There, he tied the other end of his cave reel to the shot line so that he would be able to find his way back to Dion, and began his ascent to the surface. Up to this point, Dave had spent around 15 minutes underwater. The ascent would take around 10 hours to decompress at consistently shallower depths. On his way up, Dave scribbled a note on his whiteboard to tell his first safety diver and close friend Don Shirley that he had found Dion Dreyer. I have no doubt that over the next 10 hours during his safety stops that Dave would have already been mentally preparing for another dive to 890 feet to recover Dion's body. Don Shirley was thinking the same thing. He recalls that he would have been more than comfortable to leave Dion's body in his watery grave, but he was certain Dave would want to retrieve it. It's very common for a body to be left where it lies when you're dealing with such extreme environments. It's hard enough to keep one diver alive, let alone perform a recovery mission where you need to add in complex problem solving and physical exertion. After all, Dion himself had died, quite likely from physical exertion that led to a buildup of carbon dioxide at a far shallower depth. On Mount Everest, there are a number of bodies that will never be recovered because of the danger that exists for the people who would attempt to bring those bodies back down the mountain. But, much like Don Shirley thought, when Dave got back to the surface some 10 hours later, he immediately declared that he wanted to bring Dion back to his family. Dave and Don went back to their regular lives but spent the next months meticulously planning for the recovery of Dion's body. In January 2005, Dave Shaw flew into Johannesburg International Airport and drove the 6.5 hours to Boesman's hut. On the 8th of January, Dave Shaw made his final descent. He would join Dion, and the two men's stories would be forever entangled in the cave line that Dave had set. After months of preparation, everything was going to plan. Dave had told Dion's parents he had found their son, and they were thrilled at the possibility to bring him back for a proper burial. A safety team had been assembled, including Don Shirley and Peter Herbst, who everyone in the dive industry knew as Big B. I met Big B at his dive centre in Pretoria called Reef Divers in 2004. Some 6 months before this incident took place. Peter is a larger-than-life guy who has dedicated his entire life to scuba diving. Before his final dive, Dave made his final preparations, including attaching a camera to his helmet. A documentary filmmaker had joined the team to document the recovery of Dion's body. He had created an underwater housing capable of withstanding the extreme pressures of the dive. Dave told the cameraman that he didn't normally have anything on his helmet because it gets in the way of the cable for his dive light. He would normally loop the dive light cable over the back of his neck, but with the camera on his helmet, he would not be able to make that loop. Dave said not to worry. If he needed both hands free to work Dion's body into the body bag he was taking, that he would set the dive torch down in a way that would shine onto the body so he could see what he was doing. This conversation later came out during the accident investigation. When Don Shirley heard this, he said if he had heard that conversation, he would never have agreed to that procedure. After 10 minutes descending into the cave, Dave arrived at Dion's body and immediately set about coaxing Dion's cylinder out of the mud and wrangling his body into the body bag. Dave and Don had practiced this underwater at Kamati Springs, where Don had played a dead corpse and Dave recovered Don's body. But something unexpected happened. The body began to float. When Don and Dave had consulted with forensic experts, the agreed consensus was that after 10 years underwater, the body would have been completely decomposed, leaving only a skeleton, which is negatively buoyant. It's 6. Wrangling a dead weight into a body bag is easier than fighting against a body that is trying to float away from you. At such depths, for every minute a diver spends at the bottom can result in them adding another hour of decompression to their ascent. Now, under such stress, you can imagine every minute that Dave spent working to coerce Dion's floating body into the body bag must have felt like hours. This is when Dave put down his dive torch and became focused on getting Dion's body into the bag. He eventually succeeded, but 4 fatal problems had already been set in motion. Accident investigators often talk about the death spiral. In most accidents, the final outcome is usually the result of several problems that are compounded by one another. In extreme environments like this, where stress is already built into the situation, one small problem can quickly become a very big problem. Several small problems all happening at the same time can spell disaster. And that's exactly what happened in Dave Shaw's final minutes. No matter how experienced a diver is, at depth they will also have to contend with nitrogen narcosis. Nitrogen narcosis is a neurological effect that divers describe as feeling like you've downed a martini. The deeper you go, the more martinis you have to contend with. At the depth that Dave was diving, he would have already compensated for this by decreasing the amount of nitrogen and replacing it with helium. Nonetheless, the effects of nitrogen would have been intoxicating. Much the same as drinking a beer, we all feel that we can push the envelope a little further than we probably should. And now, to make matters worse, the cable for Dave's dive torch became entangled with the dive line. In fact, the body bag, the dive line, and Dave's torch had all become entangled. In the video recovered from the camera on Dave's head, you can quite clearly see that Dave is trying to untangle the cave reel. He even pulls out a blade to cut the line. But even though the thought was there, he never did cut the line. Between the pre-existing stress of the extreme dive, the physical exertion of fighting Dion's body into the body bag, the nitrogen narcosis, and now having become entangled with Dion's body, the death spiral was complete. Dave's breathing became labored and sporadic until he took his final breath. At the first safety stop, Don Shirley's fight for survival was just starting. Don had been waiting for Dave to emerge with Dion's body. The plan was to then transfer the body to the next safety diver while Dave began his long series of decompression stops. After some time, and past the time that Dave had allocated to be at the bottom to retrieve Dion's body, Don became nervous that something wasn't right. David told Don not to come any deeper unless he signaled for help. The signal never came. But Don knew something was wrong, and so he himself broke the dive plan and descended into the depths to find Dave and Dion and provide the help he knew was needed. But Dion was not prepared for the depth, and to his dismay, as he got closer, he could see that Dave's dive light was not moving. In a moment of clarity, he did what he knew was the right thing to do and leave his friend's lifeless body with Dion's. Don now began his ascent to the surface. When he reached the next safety diver, he wrote on his whiteboard, "Dave not coming back." In a relay that began with Don, the message was sent slowly to the surface. As it passed between each safety diver, you can only imagine the sinking feeling they must have felt. What had started as a humble mission to recover a fellow diver would now end in tragedy. Don was now recalculating his decompression stops. These calculations had been planned out for months and were now changing rapidly underwater. Altering such a stringent dive plan underwater would be stressful. Don would undoubtedly have been dealing with nitrogen narcosis, and the heart-pounding loss of a very close friend whose body now lay in a murky grave meters away. He ascended to his next safety stop and handed a slate with updated calculations to the next safety diver. At the surface, the dive plan changed from a body recovery to an emergency recovery. Don had begun to suffer from decompression sickness and vertigo. The safety divers began a rotation of dives to stay with Don, who had already once before lost his grip on the safety line. Luckily, he had fought off the vertigo and regained his grip. But his condition was quickly deteriorating, and he had to rely more and more on safety divers making decisions for him. He started to get nauseous and began to throw up. Every time a safety diver moved him from one depth closer to the surface for the next decompression stop, he would dry heave and come very close to losing consciousness. Then a pain shot through his leg. By the time he got to the surface, he had skipped his final safety stop because the support divers felt he wouldn't live if he lost consciousness underwater. He was quickly taken to the on-site recompression chamber. Over the coming months, Don would have multiple hyperbaric treatments in a recompression chamber and never fully recover. As the dive sites somberly packed up their gear and began to disperse, a final dive was planned to recover the stage cylinders that remained on shot lines down to 150 meters. Peter Herbst, Big B, stayed behind for a few days with the police divers on site to recover this equipment. As Big B ascended from the dive, the police divers asked him if he had seen the bodies. He was stunned to hear that as he had pulled up the lines, both Dave and Dion's bodies were still attached to the lines, and they were now sitting under an overhang at 20 meters, 60 feet, and could easily be recovered. Big B had not seen the bodies float eerily past him as he worked at depth to recover the safety equipment. Big B then made a final dive to recover the bodies of Dave and Dion, whose life, death, and story would be entangled forever.